All right. That's it. Let's start. So, welcome everybody. We are very glad to have Yann Robiou du Pont today in our seminar. Yann is a Marie Curie fellow researcher at the University of Utrecht, and he is working on climate strategies, climate mitigation pathways, and climate pledges from the countries, and especially on the just transition and the equity in terms of pledges and targets. And he will present today a talk entitled Perspective on the Use of Equity Metrics for Ambition Assessment of Climate Pledges. Yann, the floor is yours, and that's it. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm trying to share my screen, and let's see if that works. Can you see everyone?
Yes, It's working. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. So basically, my background is in physics and like theoretical physics, and then I started doing a PhD, which embodies most of the, well, all of the peer-reviewed research you'll see in here on trying to quantify what are fair ethical principle to distribute the mitigation burden across countries to meet the Paris Agreement goals. And then following my PhD, which I finished a few years ago, I could work as a diplomatic advisor, write scientific reports for courts, and advise UN negotiations, or sometimes governments or subnational governments, on what would be Paris-aligned targets, emission targets. So this is the body of the work, and then I'll try to show an outlook of the research I want to do with the Marie Curie grant, research grant that I received, and my position at Utrecht due to start on Monday. So a little bit of a background. I guess most of you are aware of the Paris Agreement and its goals, which are ambitious global goals to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit to 1.5 degrees of global warming and achieve net zero emissions in the second half of the century. The part here that I'll be most interested in is the articulation of Article 2 that has to do with equity and raises principles of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. So this is one of the understandings of equity we can get from the Paris Agreement, and it applies to the entire agreement. So the efforts on emissions reduction, but also adaptation, loss and damage, transfer of technologies, everything. I'll focus here on emissions reduction, but bear in mind that it applies to everything. So there is this principle, but there is no clear articulation as to how this principle can translate into a formula that can decide on how much each country should contribute to the global goal of the Paris Agreement. This was attempted through the Kyoto Protocol, trying to set emissions target for specific countries and have that in the agreement, but that was only for some northern countries, so not all countries. And since the Kyoto Protocol in 97, 98, a lot of developing countries have now much greater emissions. So it is also needed to have some level of effort from their end. And also the architecture of the Kyoto Protocol was more binding in a way, but as you may know, the US signed but did not ratify. Canada left the agreement as it was not about to comply with it. So now we have the Paris Agreement, whereby all countries are supposed to pledge what they think is the most ambitious emissions target, well, target in general, but including emissions targets, to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. And there is a review cycle and a stocktake process whereby countries will collectively look at where the ensemble of emissions targets bring us and whether or not it's bringing us closer towards the Paris Agreement goals. So this is a quinquennial review process, and the first global stocktake is due this year, at the end of this year, by COP28. So part of the literature that can inform this stocktake will be looking at national level progress, but it's not the only thing that goes into the stocktake. So basically, My research here is trying to answer that question as to how much each country should be contributing to the Paris Agreement global goals. What is the level of effort or finance or emissions reduction that they should provide based on their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. This is just a quick reminder from the UN emissions gap report from last year. This basically is a lot of lines, but long story short, the top line in gray is where the current policies are bringing us, or well, policies from 2010. Current policies being the darker blue line at the second from the top, bringing us to a 2.8 degree warming. Then if we met our unconditional targets called NDCs, nationally determined contributions, it would bring us to 2.6 degrees of warming, the conditional ones to 2.4. If on top of this, we take into account the net zero pledges, which are not legally binding, unlike the Paris Agreement and the targets mentioned before, the NDCs, we could reach 1.8 degrees of global warming. And we can see that the emissions gap, the effort gap in 2030 remains very large between the current projections based on current policies or even targets and what we should be doing in order to have the best chances to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees as per the Paris Agreement. So what does the IPCC report tell us on how much countries should be doing individually? Well, not much, because the IPCC is not providing a lot of information at the national level, even more obviously in the summary for policymakers, which have to be approved by governments. This is probably the most useful information we had in an IPCC report, and I'll explain why later. This is IPCC AR4, published in 2007. And it said, for Annex 1 countries, understand developed countries, that their emissions levels in 2020 should be reduced by 25 to 40% in order to do their fair share of the global goals. At the time, it was 2 degrees. It didn't say how much non-Annex 1 countries, meaning the rest of countries, should be doing. But this was actually quite tight range, quite clear. Countries, developed countries, should reduce by anywhere from 25 to 40%. Then what did we have in the next IPCC report? So the AR5, we had, scientifically speaking, more details. So we could think it's better, it's more useful. It is somewhere more useful for scientists because here we don't have a summary of how much countries should be reducing their emissions based on the whole of literature, irrespectively of which principles of equity, which scenario, which study. It was a statistical range that gave us a quite tight range. Now, what we have here is 5 different visions of equity, the 5 blue bars. Well, one is hidden because it's well below 100%. And it shows that the OECD here should reduce its emissions anywhere from 20% to over 100% between 2010 and 2030 to align with a 2-degree goal. So we have more details, we have more visions of equity, and we have more world regions. So OECD, economies in transition, that's Eastern Europe, Russia, Asia, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Why is it less useful, according to me? Well, because for a decision maker or a judge at a court, you have to interpret which of these studies, which of these equity principle is the most applicable. And not everyone might feel comfortable with that, especially when that relies on international negotiations. So the judge might think this is outside its jurisdiction to decide on this, or even national decision makers might think that it's a diplomatic process that should decide upon this. So we have a greater range of results, and as a result, the greater the range statistically defined, the more there is room for interpretation, and the less the outcome is certainly if every country or every region here picks the least ambitious end of the range. So we had this in the IPCC AR5, and then we had nothing in the special report on 1.5 degrees. Then we had this comment in Nature by Dennis van Berkel, who's a lawyer in the Urgenda case. There was a litigation case against the Netherlands. And he called upon quantified results being more clearly laid out in the next IPCC report, which would be the IPCC AR6, and showing how important it was for judiciary processes. So yeah, he insisted that the IPCC does present a quantified analysis of the existing literature quantifying what a fair share is for a country, because this is the only metric for ambition to review the ambition of an emissions target of a country. It was not heard. This is what we had in the IPCC AR6. So we merely have a graph showing where countries are located. If you look at a graph looking at emissions per capita versus development level. So we can see some countries performing better than others, and we can see the unfairness of current development levels, but that's about it, and it doesn't really suggest what contributions could be fair from countries. So this is a bit the background, and now I'll dive into a specific case of how do we calculate these levels and what was my contribution to this field of research. This is a soon to be, let's say, a dated graph coming from my PhD on emissions levels worldwide per capita and GDP per capita also worldwide. The message from this slide is to show that it's mostly northern countries that have the highest emissions per capita, historical emissions, and GDP per capita. The only place where there's not such a strong correlation is Eastern countries that have high historical responsibility and low financial capability. But otherwise, the cut is quite clear between countries with the highest responsibility and the highest capability and those with the least. This is an example of what burden sharing can look like according to 5 different approaches. You can see the red line being a 2-degree scenario. So that's what the world should follow. This is a graph for the world, that red line. The part going up is historical levels, and the part going down is what the world should follow to limit global warming to 2 degrees. The color patches within it are the contributions from different countries, historical again, and projected according to different ways of quantifying what would be fair. I won't go into too much details, but the top left is capability. So countries with the highest GDP per capita have the lowest share of future possible emissions. Equal per capita projects reaching equal per capita emissions, not minding their wealth or historical responsibility. We have bottom left equal cumulative per capita, so to achieve exactly the same historical contribution by the end of 2100, with some countries having to have strong negative emissions, etc. And that gives our article that we had published in Nature Climate Change in 2017, where we quantified those different trajectories according to these different principles for all countries in the world. So you can see the results for our countries on the interactive website called Paris Equity Check. It's all peer-reviewed results. So here in the case of Australia, we can see, so the red line at the top is actually not fair. It's everyone decreases emissions at the same rate, which means that we preserve the current inequalities because every country would preserve its current share of the total emission through time, through fair time. But it's a good reference. Most developed countries' emissions targets align with it. So you could say it's like they all tend to net zero emissions at the same date, but they don't, care for the current unfairness of the emissions distributions globally. It's called grandfathering, this approach, and the equitable trajectory has been being much more stringent. So we can see here also that a problem remains that what if each country picks an approach that is fair, but the one that is the most lenient for it? In other words, each vision of equity works if all countries follow it, but it breaks down if everyone picks a different approach. So we have essentially 5 here different metrics of ambition. So this is the map that we got looking at how many visions of burden sharing each country's climate pledge aligned with, but we wanted to provide one metric of ambition that could include all of the visions of equity that reflect the Paris Agreement. This is on the left, this is the US NDC justification for how the target is fair and ambitious. Countries have to provide that. And it's interesting to see that they are required to explain how it's fair and ambitious. And those two words go together. I didn't put them together. That's how they are called for, because fairness is the measure for ambition. The US justified the ambition of their first target by saying the target is fair and ambitious, period. In the second target, the most recent one, it's on the right-hand side, and it says, the US target exceeds a straight line path to achieving net zero emissions economy-wide by no later than 2050, and it also promotes the goal of keeping within reach 1.5 degrees Celsius on average. So basically, it does say that it's doing better than grandfathering, than a strict straight line where everyone reaches net zero at the same time. But it doesn't say how much, or it doesn't say really how much it should be doing, or what is the formula defining the ambition of their contribution. So here is a map of which of the 5 approaches favors the most each country. And unsurprisingly, the unfair one, the orange one, is favoring northern countries. Countries with the lowest GDP per capita are the most favored by a capability-based approach, and many countries are most favored by historical responsibility here in yellow. Now, what happens if each country picks the most favorable approach? Obviously, we aim at 2 degrees, but we will overshoot it. But each country can still say, I did my fair share according to a vision of equity. We just don't agree on which one. So we did, this is a schema showing what it could look like. 2 possible approaches of sharing the cake on the left-hand side, approach 1 and approach 2, to 2 countries for the sake of simplicity, A and B. Equity approach 1 favors country A, and equity approach 2 favors country B. So if A follows 1 and B follows 2, it doesn't add up. We aim at 2 degrees, we get to 2.5. Each country can still say they aimed at 2 according to a different formula. So what we said is, okay, well, if we can't agree on what's fair and we aim at 2, we get to 2.5, how much should we be aiming at to actually overshoot and get to 2? We could find a virtual scenario, and we said that if countries then aimed at 1.3 degree warming, then they could each apply the vision of fairness that is the most favorable to them, the one that is the least stringent for themselves. So it is a self-differentiated approach of equity, which can be seen as in line with the Paris Agreement, where each country put forward its own targets and explains it according to its own vision of fairness. But it doesn't have to be seen as a more fair distribution of the mitigation effort. It can also simply be seen as a metric for ambition that reflects seemingly contradicting visions of equity. In other words, in the absence of agreement on what is fair, in the absence of agreement on a metric for ambition, we are not left without anything. We have this metric that combines conflicting views of equity in order to assess the ambition of a given country. So here we have the thick solid lines in the middle showing what the 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios are globally, the virtual ones that are associated, what we should aim at, 1.1 and 1.3 degrees, in order to be able to have each country applying a different approach and eventually actually get to 1.5 or 2. And otherwise, if we aim at 1.5 or 2 simply and apply different visions of equity, we'd get to 2 to 2.5 degrees of warming. Interestingly, the NDCs, the gray points you can see, are somewhere in there. So it doesn't mean that this is what's happening, but it's as if the world is in a situation where each country does follow a vision of equity that favors its narrative. Some countries are doing better than all visions of equity that we model. We saw that in the map earlier. Some are doing worse, but collectively, it matches quantitatively. So by applying this new sharing approach to different emission scenarios, 1.5, 2, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, etc., we essentially get a metric and a correspondence between what countries' share is in 2030 in terms of emissions and what is the global warming associated with that sharing? Or in other words, if we share a 3-degree scenario, what is the share of India in terms of emissions in 2030? Well, it's basically 100% emissions increase compared to 2010 for India. So if we look at then where on that line that you can see their current target falls, we can say how much global warming it's in line with. So we have that warming metric. In other words, Mexico, by pledging to have an emissions level roughly at the same level in 2030 as it was in 2010, has a pledge in line with a 2.8 degree warming, meaning if the rest of the world followed the ambition of Mexico, according to respectively each country's on target, the world would get to 2.8 degree warming. So now that we have this, we have a map quantifying the warming associated with, in terms of ambition, with the emissions target of each country. This is what we had for the first range of emissions targets, the one prior to the Paris Agreement. And this is what we have now since COP27. So it is a bit brighter. It is still not green. The US has gone from 4 degrees to 3.4, somewhere there. If you go on Paris Equity Check, you can see everything interactive. You can click on countries. The EU has gone from 3.2 to 2.5, so there is some improvement. It's still insufficient. You can see that a lot of sub-Saharan countries are green. Even if they don't depart from business as usual trajectories, they will still be green for the simple reason that their emissions levels are so low, their historical contribution to the current global warming is so low, and their financial capabilities are so low that it wouldn't be fair to ask them to make efforts to reduce their contribution to a problem we almost entirely created without them. So long story short, this kind of literature, what we produced was used in, well, IPCC reports, UN reports, but also interestingly, the UK Committee on Climate Change, which is an independent body supervised by scientists and advising the British government on climate policies, has suggested the British government to reduce its emissions by 68% and has justified it using our work, amongst other things. And the UK later adopted our target, so they used our work to justify that it was a fair contribution to the realization of the Paris Agreement. But it's also used, so it's used by government, it's used also by diplomatic teams, which I also advise directly at times, and to know how much they should be either asking as supplementary effort from other countries or even support, and how much they should support other countries for the greater ambition that they may have. But it's also been used by legal action. So at the end of my PhD, I was reached out by some NGOs asking me, how can you explain to a judge whether or not a country's ambition is sufficient? So there are other metrics out there. There's the Climate Action Tracker, which is probably the most famous, which is not a peer-reviewed work, but very good quality and based on peer-reviewed literature. And there are other studies trying to also suggest some combination of different equity principles to derive a single metric for assessing ambition. The Climate Action Tracker simply does a statistical analysis. So same as what we saw in my first article, a greater ambition, according to that tracker, means that a country's target is in line with more studies showing what is a fair share for that country of the 1.5 degree goal. So it doesn't really care which approach of equity, and it just does a statistical positioning. So to me, it doesn't really say that it's more ambitious. It says that it's ambitious according to more studies. But then we can see different values that we can give to statistical analysis of philosophical principles. The sixth assessment report suggested some ways to improve that literature, and it said we should link that literature on ambition assessment applied to mitigation targets with adaptation and loss and damage, and also quantify what is the amount of international support, meaning international finance, that could feed what a fair share is, because nothing here says that to meet your fair share, your mitigation target, you need to do it only territorially. So for instance, the US, to meet what a fair share is, could do a combination of territorial emissions reduction and contribution to reducing global emissions, including by supporting other countries where mitigation is cheaper. So maybe briefly how it's used by courts. How long did you say? 40 minutes, did you say, Loic? Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yes.
how it's used by courts here is an interesting example. I didn't know of it, but I think it highlights the importance as a scientist to do summary sentences. What may have sounded obvious to all of you is that, of course, if each country takes a different way of doing burden sharing of a given amount of emission, then it doesn't add up. And so in this article, we did write, of course, if each country picks its own vision or the least stringent vision of burden sharing, it wouldn't be sufficient to limit global warming to the targeted amount. We had, in the case of Urgenda, the Dutch litigation cases, the court ruling that the Dutch government should reduce emissions by at least 25%, which was the least ambitious end of the range that we saw at the beginning, the recommendation from the fourth assessment of the IPCC report, recommending countries to mitigate emissions from 25 to 40%. It was a progress. It was a historical decision that marked a new era in climate litigation. For the first time, a country was ruled to act more on climate change. But of course, if every country does the least ambitious end of a range, it still doesn't add up. And that sounds obvious, but writing it was important. And why was it so important? By writing specifically that systematic court decisions that governments must follow the least ambitious end of an equity range would be insufficient to achieve the Paris Agreement goal, was used as part of a reasoning to justify that we could sue governments directly to the European Courts of Human Rights, even when we should normally sue individually countries before their own courts, and only after we've lost so many times we can go to the European Courts of Human Rights. Here the argument was that even if we win against every single country, but each country picks the least ambitious, or each decision by the judge follows the ruling of the Urgenda case and picks the least ambitious end of the range, it wouldn't add up. And that was accepted by the court. So the European Courts of Human Rights will be looking at this case, and they will be hearing next month. And so it was used as an argument for the court to look at it directly. And the interesting thing here is that this is a legal case against 33 European countries and the EU. And so if the reasoning works at a national level and at the EU level, which is a group of countries, theoretically, it can only be a formula that adds up also to the national level. It cannot be that the EU is the sum of dissonant fair shares and still a fair share itself. Within that case, I'm just showing here what type of literature they used. They used also to assess what should be the contribution of respective countries. They used the climate action tracker. They use also the part of an analysis published in a paper here. So I won't go into too much details as to how the climate action tracker works, but it was to mention what type of literature they use. This is so I did write the co-author the scientific report to the European Court of Human Rights, which is why I can tell you what's inside. This is a case I also contributed to against the EU. This one lost. And here what's interesting is to show that, of course, we do present the best available literature, but still we have to explain to the judge how sound the reasoning is. So we do simple graphs with straight lines to show that the reasoning is robust. So if we share the remaining budget across countries and the EU is to use it as a straight line, this is, when it should phase out. So part of the work when explaining the science is to explain the best available science, but also make the judge, who's not an expert of this field, comfortable with the reasoning developed in the literature, especially when it cannot lean on IPCC results, but has to look at studies individually. So there are many more litigation cases, and I could also share my experience working on others, but this is for countries, and equity targets only apply to countries or cities, but they apply to people or groups of people. They don't apply to companies that have no inherent right to exist. New countries can appear, countries can disappear, they can buy one another, they can sink one another. So these metrics don't apply to company. And actually having a emissions target for a company does not allow to claim that a company is 1.5 degree aligned. There is no emissions level that a company should follow in order to align with a given warming target. So how do we do in a legal case against a company? Well, there was, again, in the Netherlands, a legal case against the Dutch company Shell, and the judge ruled that the emissions reduction of Shell should be 45%, because the world should reduce its emissions by 45%. It is not a decision that really aligns with what is the emissions reduction that the oil sector should follow, or something that was scientifically established by the literature. But it does work in the sense that if every company reduces by 45%, then it would effectively limit the global emissions to 45% and align with a 1.5 degree warming. Of course, we don't need the same reduction from all companies. PV company could probably increase its emission. Coal company shouldn't even decrease its emissions. It should just stop its activity or disappear. But that's how the judge took the case, in my interpretation. So there is some strategic thinking into the asks that we present to the judge and how these are phrased so that the judge understands the relevance of possible asks in light of the law that it's supposed to rule upon. Here I wrote what you see on the bottom left, which is the scientific note to the court on a case against French oil company TotalEnergies. So here there are several asks that, well, it depends on the law that you're basing the legal action upon, but basically here it's asking for Total to tackle all of its emissions, including the emissions embedded in the products it sells, meaning the oil. Also asking for no new oil exploration, given that the entire oil fields already discovered worldwide, if they are used all the way, would be enough to bring global warming to above 1.5 degrees. We could also think of using the IPCC IPCC emissions levels from the emission scenarios aligning with 1.5 degrees for the oil sectors. So there's a range of literature we can bring up to the attention of the judge for the court to decide on whether or not Total is helping or actually preventing the world from reaching the Paris Agreement goals, amongst others, because there's many other arguments that are helpful in determining that Total is not helping the world to reach 1.5, including their own statements. A brief outlook, what I'll be doing. So if we look back at the IPCC suggestions, adaptation and loss and damage, this is currently, so it's not linked legally under the Paris Agreement. A failure to meet or the lack of ambition on mitigation doesn't bring additional action on adaptation, etc. But this is something we can do as scientists, and this is something I intend to do. Yeah, trying to also refine the ethics of the approach is something important. The question of how much finance, as I mentioned, I'll get into that now, and also trying to quantify what ambition means for subnational governments and non-state actors, including companies. This is just a reminder that here we talked for the entire time about territorial emissions, because this is the emissions that are negotiated under the UN. Because countries are only sovereign on their land, it doesn't prevent scientific studies to look at emissions coming from consumption, coming from exports, etc. So I'm just showing here that there are different metrics, and if you get to the slides, you can see the links to the literature. So here I will just explain to you what equity means in relation to IPCC scenarios and how finance can play a role. This is a schematic figure for a developed country. So here we have what's in blue is the national, the territorial emissions reduction projected as part of an IPCC scenario. And that's entirely based on socioeconomic cost, on a carbon tax. So where in the world is it most efficient to reduce emissions? And a lot of the time, it's not in developed countries because the efficiency is already quite high and the costs are quite high, and it's cheaper to reduce emissions in, for instance, Southeast Asia. So for developed countries, we have relatively not so stringent trajectory based on the implementation that should happen on the territory of a developed country, and comparatively a much more ambitious and much more stringent emissions reduction trajectory based on equity, meaning that the blue curve is how much should happen to be the most efficient globally, territorially, physically, on the ground of countries. But the red line, the equity, defines how much the country is responsible for funding, for contributing to. And to meet both of these lines that add up to the same amount across our countries, obviously, which is the 1.5 degree scenario, or 2 degree, whichever you want to follow. Then a country would implement domestically the blue curve and fund the reduction of the red curve. And to this end, it would purchase the difference between those two curves at a price that we can infer from the carbon price assumed in the IPCC scenarios that are used to define where the mitigation happens and what technologies are used, etc. And then we can quantify how much support a developed country should get. Likewise, we'd have the opposite for a developing country, and we could get how much finance it should receive that could help funding mitigation options so that this country doesn't follow the carbon-intensive development that a developed country followed. So yeah, this is what I summarize here. And I will finish with the last report that I did, and which is not peer-reviewed yet, but it will be submitted to peer review soon. And this is a report that was commissioned by CVF countries, which is a group of 58 sub-Saharan African countries and other countries, vulnerable countries, but mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And they commissioned a report where they wanted a new approach of equity. And what we did that was very new here is to release the constraint that the emissions allocation to a country, the emission scenario that you saw before here, we release the need that they are continuous, meaning that the equitable level, the red line here, wouldn't start at today's emissions level for that country. And that would look like this. So if you look at the top graph, this is for G7 globally, but it would look similar for a G7 country. And that what you see on the left, the black line is current emissions, historical emissions. And what you see in red is fair emissions levels. And you can see it's only a fraction of current emissions levels, meaning that it's impossible, of course, to achieve this domestically, but in order to meet their fair share, the G7 should obviously reduce emissions quite strongly, perhaps along what they pledged already and as the green dot in their NDC, but also fund the emissions reduction corresponding to what they owe, corresponding to the area between the two curves. And for climate vulnerable foreign countries, the graph you can see on the bottom right, you can see that their fair share is actually much higher than their current emissions levels. And they could sell that emissions difference to fund the bending of their emissions curve so that they never get to cross, the actual emissions never get to cross their fair share levels. You can see that with their NDC, the green dot, they already have foregone 75% of the emissions that would be fair for them by 2030. So that's already what they called debt relief, the environmental debt that the world has towards them. So that's already part of a debt relief of 75% of what could be their fair share. And then they could increase the ambition of the NDCs as well, thanks to international finance. And bearing in mind that finance is needed, all the IPCC scenarios do not tell how much a country is supposed to fund. They just tell where the mitigation is the most efficient to happen. And for that scenario to happen, finance needs to be available. the scenario don't say who should pay or if it's a donation or a loan, but pragmatically, these countries need to have access to capital, and capital is often hard to get. It costs even more than for developed countries. So pragmatically, they need to have access to finance. The Paris Agreement, once again, does require equity to be accounted for when sharing the mitigation burden. And finance is a part of the Paris Agreement. Developed countries have committed to provide support. They have also, before the Paris Agreement, committed to providing $100 billion annually, starting in 2020. They have not met that pledge. It's still not to date. And this pledge will be renegotiated, and hopefully this kind of literature can inform how much such a pledge should be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was super interesting. We have now the time for opening the floor to questions or reactions or commentaries. So if anybody wants to, yeah, I see that Alejandro is raising his hand, so you can go.
Okay, thank you, Luis. Do you hear me without problems? Yeah, perfect. Okay, first of all, congratulations for your presentation. First of all, to comment that your institution have been analyzing your institution while you are doing the presentation is so similar to our program in the goals, our institution in the goals. So it's so similar, looking for this transition, energy transition in our world. So I'm going, because my approach is from an economic point of view, I'm going to give you two general questions. So feel free to answer in the way that you consider. First of all, do you think that at the end, are we going to have the different countries involved in this transition enough money, enough capacity to invest to get the final goals? Could be the general question, your opinion. So feel free to answer whatever you think under your point of view. And the second one, do you think that the last event, Ukraine crisis, COVID included, could be accelerate the procedure? So, because my feel is that we are going to move on quickly or faster than in the past. For example, talking about digitalization, for sure, the COVID-19 has given us one punch to jump in our digitalization in our world. So my guess is that perhaps, I don't know, perhaps we are going to run, not in similar way, but probably we're going to run in this decarbonization process. So you are more expert in this area. So what do you think? I know perfectly that the two questions are very general and different, very difficult to answer, but I would like to know your opinion after to see your presentation. And again, thank you and congratulations for the presentation, Jan.
Thanks a lot. To your first question as to, how we'll get there and mobilize sufficient finance, I think in equity terms, I'm obviously not saying that the world needs to follow what is equitable according to me or any article, or even philosophically, or according to every country in order for us to succeed. But there are levels of unfairness that are simply unacceptable. And like I said, there cannot be the level of mitigation supposed to happen according to the IPCC scenarios in some countries without finance. Countries recognize this, then the question is how much finance? I read as a takeaway message from the IPCC AR6 that the annual reduction in global GDP growth by 2050 annually is 0.04 to 0.09 percentage point to stay below 2 degrees. This seems so low. And in the meantime, the GDP, the global GDP would at least double. This seems to me as a very, very little cost to climate change. It is a big cost overall. It is a relatively limited cost. So of course, the world has many other agendas to work on, and climate change is not the only goal, especially for a lot of countries. But we're talking about a lot of funding, but we're also talking about a lot of funding anyway to fund even a dirty development. So the question is more, how much do we invest? And a lot of it has a lot of co-benefits. So whether it's air quality, whether it's a better lifestyle, and obviously avoided climate impacts. So the question, I think, will be very organic, depending on negotiations. At the level, it is clear that finance is very insufficient, and that is also why we are seeing so little action. But beyond finance, looking at the emissions of northern countries, we have the finance, we have the money, and we're showing little to no effort. I mean, how much of the emissions reduction happening in Europe is really because of climate efforts, climate law? A lot of it is because industries are living. A lot of it is because anyway, we have marginal improvement in the economy due to better efficiency and reductions of costs that are not climate driven. So more and more countries now are getting red on my map because their emissions levels are increasing. But the developed countries have agreed to take the lead and have never shown in the past 30 years a real effort to reduce their emissions, to develop the technologies that can be used for it. I mean, Germany has invested a little bit on solar panel, and we saw the effect. Solar panels costs have reduced by a lot. China has also contributed to that decrease. But it really takes some effort, and I think finance is obviously a big impediment for a lot of countries, but it's not the only reason. And your second question was the effect of the war in Ukraine or such crisis, but perhaps COVID as well. My expertise is on equity, so here it's more of a guess and of a feeling based on my experience also working with diplomacy. But my feeling is that Europe is starting to take other things more seriously than just its economic growth or like business as usual. It's looking at its vulnerability, and clearly our reliance in Europe on fossil fuel is a structural issue. And I think renewable energy do bring an answer to that and do help with energy security. So I think that will help with this. There is the threat of relying too much on natural gas, which is a problem, which, I mean, the current infrastructure is already beyond what is, according to the IEA, in line with a 1.5 degree scenario, and we're globally developing more. So that is an issue to keep an eye on. But I think a lot of countries now really want to be more energy efficient, to depend less on the rest of the world. And I think, yeah, I think you could see that it can also make an effort on some things. The war in Ukraine is costing the EU a lot, and not just because of the help provided. And we can see that we can do it. We can invest on things. We can care. We can make efforts. So I think that's helping there. I don't know exactly how it's impacting. I think it's having much less of an impact outside the global north than in the global north, for many reasons. But I think if countries do move, if the EU does move, if the US also moves now that the Trump presidency is over, and now also thanks to the IRA, the development of these technologies will help. And not only the development, it's hard to tell countries don't do like us and jump directly to a technology we're not even using. A lot of developing countries want to use things that work. And so I think we have to demonstrate, we have to do it and not just tell them what to do.
Thank you, Yann, for the question, because goals were not easy to answer, but thank you for your point of view. Thank you.
Does someone has a question? Yeah, Peter, I think.
Thank you. And I'm sorry I cannot turn on my camera since I was back and forth walking. Thank you so much, Yann, for your presentation. Dank je wel. I would like to ask you, I have a dream question, which is, now you work with policy people, with governments, with the courts, and so based on scientific data that you provide or your colleagues. And let's say you have resources to tackle the climate issue. And so this is really a very general, broad, but a dream question on your side. What would you do, or what would be the three sectors, main sectors, or at least one issue that you think would have most relevance and impact when it comes to policy change so that we are better in climate action?
So I understand the question is not how I would use it for my research.
It could be, but it's what is your dream? What is, in a sense, based on the information you have, experience, where would you tackle policy? What would be the best approach to get there as fast as we can and have to?
I find it really hard to answer. My experience working with people with very different disciplines is that we tend to see the solution in our disciplines. It's pretty hard based on the law that I work with. I do find that law could have a strong impact, but I do understand when you talk to people working with, economists, they think that, having the right price for things would really smoothen the transition, etc. In terms of implementation and sectors, I think we can look at, for instance, IPCC scenarios and try to see where the investments need to be or what technologies it relies upon the most. I don't know if money could solve that. Quite often, depending on how it's spent, it's actually having the opposite effect. But I think having better governance, better transparency as to why the decisions are taken. And this is where, to me, it's interesting with courts. Internationally, we negotiate, and we're negotiating across sovereign states, and it does make sense. Politically, we're negotiating, but we're not negotiating necessarily on rational grounds all the time. And of course, it's certainly not a good idea to leave policymaking to scientists, but I think the transparency is really lacking in many cases, and we have a lot of compromises made by politicians based on also the handling of the communication and public opinions. And I think this is where we don't see this with courts. With the courts, they are looking at, okay, if I'm taking the case as to whether or not a country is doing enough, and if I decide that the law enables me to tell that the government should be doing its share of the Paris Agreement, for instance, then they have to look at the existing metric. They have to look at the science, and they don't go, oh, well, the science says this much, but what is really acceptable, or how much, what should be the compromise? They say, well, the government has to do that. And then the government and its separation of powers has to find a way to get there. And I think we did commit collectively to the Paris Agreement. Science does tell us it's possible. Now we need more transparency and accountability through also our governance, but that's not really my area of expertise directly.
Thank you. These are great insights.
I don't know if you go, Bailey, we wanted to ask something.
Oh, yes, actually, I have two quick questions. The first relates to the way we could achieve the goals, because you presented really clearly two approaches, the one which is related to international negotiation and NDCs, and the other one which is related to a legal approach with litigation. And I was just wondering for you now, what do you still hope that we will be able to have targets which are equitable, or will it be only reached through legal procedure? And my second question was related to private companies. So you explained really clearly that it's not as easy as that to apply the same approach for private companies, but at the same time, it seems that we need targets for those companies which emit a lot and are responsible for a large part of those emissions. So how can we relate those national goals with the private companies, which on the one hand are related legally to the national countries, but at the same time which can go abroad, and we see that it's complex. So that's it. Thank you very much for the presentation as well.
Whether I do hope that we get to an equitable outcome, I don't even know exactly what equitable is. I try to quantify different perceptions of equity. I do wonder how much, I mean, I guess to some extent, this is the world where we're living in. We have in negotiations, of course, always unfair outcome that somewhere do represent a level of unfairness in the powers negotiating. But we also have some progress in some things despite some unfairness. So it's about reaching a level of fairness that is acceptable, also given powers at play. And I think here, in some way, the reliance on developing countries for achieving that goal is actually something that does require us to be more fair, and maybe it can also help us bringing more equitable outcome that will also help with ideally biodiversity and other global environmental impact we can have. So yeah, I hope. It is the same fair share that do advise court decisions and international negotiations. Of course, at international negotiations, countries have to claim very often that it's science-based. They have to claim that it's equity-based. I mean, Saudi Arabia officially really cares about the equity implication and the impact on people of potential adverse impact of climate mitigation policies. And they would quote the Gilets jaunes happening in France in the reaction to a hefty carbon tax. And a lot of it is justified like this internationally. It doesn't mean, obviously, that equity is the drive for their policies and objectives, but it is a basis, and it is the same basis for discussing the ambition. So there can be an alignment here. For the subnational, for the company, this is a point of view that, according to me, needs to come at some point. So far, we wanted companies to commit, and we wanted them to be there, and we wanted not to be too hard on them because they're not signatories of the Paris Agreement. And so there were initiatives such as science-based targets, which provided what they claim is science-based targets, even though there's nowhere scientific reference explaining how any of these companies' targets could be claimed to be aligned with 1.5-degree goal or any goal. To me, it's becoming a problem because a lot of companies are more looking now for a seal of being green than actually innovating to enable that transition. And to me, what is needed is for governments to set the national frame, the legal framework for emissions to reduce. So prevent new oil exploration, set an end to thermal coal, reduce consumption, increase insulation of buildings, etc. Or even limit the emissions of a sector, or better carbon price, or say that the current emissions level per kilometer of a given car, the most efficient now, will be the minimum in 5 years. They set policies, and then companies have to fight, have to innovate to be the most efficient given that framework. And all of the policies, all of the options, all of the prices I hypothesized in the IPCC scenarios for 2030, by definition, do not exist yet. The technologies that are supposed to capture carbon in the future, they don't exist. The price of PV that they assume for 20 years from now, they do not exist. So we need to invent them. Companies need to help, and they need to invent them. But we need the right framework for them to innovate. And maybe they'll find even better solutions that we didn't think of. But we need to make a legal framework so that they can't escape that innovation and that it becomes part of their mission. Their mission is to be financially viable. So we need to set the other indicators so that they have their fight to be financially viable within that legal framework enables innovation. And then we don't require them. We don't need them specifically to have emissions targets. They can use it as a mechanism to also innovate. They can be carbon tax, etc. What we need them to do is to stop lying for some of them, stop misinformation, stop saying that some emissions are not theirs, etc., or hiding whatever their activities are leading to in different countries, or lying on climate change like many companies did, or do greenwashing, or use the lobby to water down some policies that are getting very pressing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yann. I'm sorry I have to step in and call it for the day because it's already 10, and it was super interesting. As always, I'm the last one to talk and I don't have time for my questions, but I will keep them for next time because you will be back on our more technical and modeling seminar. And that's good because most of my questions are more on the way of modeling and doing scenarios that would be more equitable. I know that it's a strong demand and recent demand from developing countries and developing country researchers, but we will keep that for next time. And that's it. That was super interesting. And for the ones who were not there, we will send them the recording. Thank you all, and have a nice weekend for you who are in Europe, and have a nice days for the others.
Thanks, everyone. And you can go and look at Paris Equity Check, and there's a lot of things you can click on to find some explanation. And there's the links to the underlying articles, and you're welcome to write me if you have other questions.
Thank you very much, Yann. See you all.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a nice
Bye.
weekend.
Bye-bye.